Have you ever felt like your HOA is spying on you? You might think it's just paranoia, but for Dave, the reality of it all would leave anyone speechless. It all began in the most ordinary of settings, a quiet suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns and pristine homes. Dave, a homeowner who had lived in his community for over a decade, loved the peace and stability of his home. He had never had any issues with his HOA before, aside from the usual dues and annual inspections, which were always minor inconveniences. But one simple decision, one that many people take for granted, would open a door to an entire world of corruption, control, and deceit that Dave never thought existed in his suburban paradise. It started with a small idea. Dave wanted a bit more privacy in his backyard, after years of living next door to a family with young children who often played outside. He thought it might be nice to install a small fence to separate his backyard from theirs. It was nothing extravagant, just a low wooden fence that wouldn't obstruct anyone's view. After considering it, Dave decided to submit a request to the HOA for approval. He thought it would be a simple process. The HOA had always been reasonable in the past, and this seemed like a basic request. Surely, they would approve it without much hassle. To Dave's surprise, the response was anything but simple. A week later, he received an email from the HOA board with a rejection. The reason given was vague at best, a reference to aesthetic guidelines and visual harmony. No specific rule or clause was cited to explain why his fence couldn't be built. The email simply stated that his proposal didn't align with the vision of the neighborhood. Dave was baffled. There had been fences in other yards, some taller, some more elaborate, so why was his request being denied? As he reread the email, a sinking feeling began to settle in his stomach. But it wasn't just the rejection that troubled him, it was the fine that followed. Attached to the email was an invoice for a fine, a significant one. The fine was for what the HOA described as a violation of property modification rules. Dave couldn't believe it. He hadn't done anything yet. His fence was still just an idea. How could they fine him for something that hadn't even happened? Confused and angry, he immediately contacted the HOA, asking for clarification. But the response he received was equally vague and unsatisfactory. The HOA representatives explained that the fine was based on a possible future violation. Given his intent to modify his property, this made no sense to Dave. How could they fine him for something that was merely a plan? Frustrated, Dave decided to talk to some of his neighbors. What he discovered was both shocking and infuriating. Over the years, many of his neighbors had received similar fines for trivial reasons that had little to do with maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetics or functionality. One neighbor had been fined for parking a second car in his own driveway, despite the fact that the neighborhood had no rule about parking. Another neighbor had been fined for mowing their lawn a few minutes past the officially sanctioned time because apparently the HOA had a rule about noise restrictions, even on weekends. And yet another had been fined for decorating their house with red and green Christmas lights, which the HOA deemed too bold and not in line with the community's preferred color palette. It seemed that no matter what the residents did, they were being fined for something. That's when Dave realized the unthinkable. The HOA was no longer just about maintaining the neighborhood. It had become a money-making machine, preying on homeowners' every move. The fines were not about improving the community, they were about filling the HOA's coffers. The more he thought about it, the more the pattern became clear. The fines were designed to be a consistent source of income, and just as Dave was starting to piece this all together, something even more troubling happened. One evening, he received an anonymous letter. The letter contained detailed information that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his community and the HOA. The letter explained that the HOA was using the fines as a means to generate revenue. But it didn't stop there. The money wasn't just being used to fund neighborhood improvements, as the HOA claimed. No, the money was being hidden in secret accounts, and it wasn't being spent on the neighborhood at all. The HOA was operating as a business, profiting off its residents, and it had been doing so for years. Dave could hardly believe what he was reading. The HOA, which he had always trusted to maintain the neighborhood, was secretly exploiting the residents. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were creating rules for the sole purpose of making money. Determined to expose the truth, Dave decided to investigate further. He began digging into the HOA's financial records, looking for any trace of where the fines were going. What he uncovered was even more disturbing than he could have imagined. The HOA had created hidden accounts that were never disclosed to homeowners. They were funneling money into secret investments, projects that had nothing to do with the neighborhood. It was clear that the HOA was using the residents' money to fund their own interests, rather than using it for the community's benefit. But it wasn't just the financial exploitation that bothered David. Was the way the HOA had been manipulating the residents. The fines were just the tip of the iceberg. The HOA had been using fear tactics to maintain control over the homeowners. They imposed vague, confusing rules, knowing that homeowners would either comply out of fear or be fined for not complying. Many residents didn't question the fines, because they assumed they must have done something wrong. The HOA was preying on their lack of knowledge. The more Dave uncovered, the more angry and disillusioned he became. After gathering enough evidence, Dave decided it was time to confront the HOA. He wasn't going to let them get away with this any longer. He called a meeting with some of his neighbors who had also been affected by the fines, and together, they prepared to confront the board. The meeting was tense from the start. The HOA board members sat behind their polished desks, acting as though they were completely unaware of the growing dissatisfaction among the residents. Dave, armed with his evidence, laid everything out. He showed them the secret accounts, the hidden investments, and the pattern of fines that were designed to generate revenue. At first, the board members tried to deny everything. They claimed the fines were necessary to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetics, and that they were doing everything by the book. But Dave wasn't buying it. He pointed out how the rules were intentionally vague and selectively enforced. It wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood, it was about control and profit. The confrontation was intense, with emotions running high on both sides. The HOA board members were defensive, but it was clear they were starting to feel the pressure. They tried to deflect blame, but the evidence was undeniable. The meeting ended without a resolution, but Dave knew that this wasn't over. He wasn't going to stop until the HOA was held accountable for its actions. The next step was clear: legal action. He and his neighbors hired lawyers and prepared to take the matter to court. The legal battle that followed would last for months, but Dave was determined to see it through. The case gained national attention as homeowners from across the country watched in awe. If Dave could take down his corrupt HOA, maybe others could do the same. The court battle was long and grueling. Dave and his neighbors presented their evidence, showing how the HOA had been exploiting them for years. The HOA tried to defend itself, but it was clear that they had been using the fines to line their own pockets. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of Dave and his neighbors. The HOA was found guilty of profiting from fines, and they were ordered to pay back all the money they had collected. The HOA was also required to change its policies, making them more transparent and fair to homeowners. The court ruling was a landmark victory, setting a precedent for homeowners across the country. The victory wasn't just for David, was for everyone who had ever felt powerless against their HOA. The story of Dave and his neighbors spread like wildfire, sparking a movement among homeowners. People began to realize that they had the power to stand up to their HOA and demand accountability. The victory had given them hope and a voice. It was no longer about one neighborhood, it was about a nationwide movement to take back control. From the HOA, as the dust settled, homeowners across the country began to demand transparency from their own HOAs. They realized that they, too, could challenge unfair rules and fight back against unjust fines. Dave's victory had inspired a wave of change, and now, homeowners were no longer afraid to question the authority of their HOAs. The power had shifted. Homeowners were no longer the victims, they were the ones in control. So, what about you? Could your HOA be hiding something from you? Are you unknowingly paying for rules that don't even exist? This story isn't just about one man's battle against the HOA, it's about the fight for fairness, transparency, and justice in every neighborhood. If you've ever felt like your HOA is unfairly controlling your life, now is the time to take action. The power to change things is in your hands. Don't let your HOA continue to take advantage of you. You deserve better. Stand up, speak out, and let's make sure no HOA can ever exploit its residents again.